It's just after midnight, and you know what that means. You're listening to The Witching Hour on Channel X. October 7th. Today is a very significant date in the history of horror, literature, and one of the most popular writers of all time. Today is the day that we lost Edgar Allan Poe. And to mark this date, I brought in one of the foremost experts on Poe to talk about what happened. So tonight, please welcome special guest Jeff Jerome, the Curator Emeritus of the Poe House and Museum in Baltimore. Welcome to the show, Jeff.
Oh, thank you. I'm so pleased to be here talking about one of my favorite people, and that's Edgar Allan Poe.
Absolutely. And that's exactly why I brought you in. As far as my knowledge goes, you're the foremost expert. I don't know, you might know some others, but you're the first one I thought of to talk to when I wanted to do a little show on Edgar for October 7th. So,
well, there's always somebody smarter than you. And I found out with Poe, you can never say, I know all there is to know about Poe, because there's so much about him. I'm still learning after all these many years. I'm still willing to keep my mind open and learn more about him.
That's the way I kind of have to look at things too. Even when you get to the point that people are praising you left and right for something, you still have to realize that you're always going to find someone who might know a little more than you do down the line. So
that's right.
Now, before we talk about Poe, well, I guess this kind of is about Poe, but I'd like to ask about your background. Like, when did you first get into Poe? How did you get into Poe? From there, maybe how did you get involved with the Poe House and become the curator? Just a little background, if you wouldn't mind.
Oh, sure. No problem. I was first introduced to Edgar Allan Poe through the Roger Corman, Vincent Price movies. Now, we're going back a couple decades. Those movies came out in the early 1960s, and I was a little kid at that time. And at that time, if you were under 16 years old, you were not allowed to see these movies. I guess they thought they would, if you would watch these movies, you would become a criminal or something like that. So what would happen is a group of us in the neighborhood would find someone who was over 16, pay his way into the movie house. He would go in first, and then he would open the side doors. And then the kids would come running in. And,
right.
The manager knew what was going on. As long as we didn't, create a fuss, he just looked the other way. So here I am sitting in the neighborhood movie theater looking at this big screen before me. And here comes the opening lines, Edgar Allan Poe. And that name alone just got my attention. So then Vincent Price comes on, and I was just so, I'm tempted to say scared, but even at that young age, I knew it was just a movie, but my goodness, it certainly made an impression on me. And I saw all the Vincent Price movies, and that's what captured my imagination. That's the hook that grabbed me into Edgar Allan Poe and Vincent Price, for that matter.
Yeah, I'm actually a huge fan of those Corman, Vincent Price Poe movies myself. As you probably remember, I've done some public Halloween shows under the name the Masquerade of the Red Death, modeled it after the story. Yeah,
I remember that. Yes. Well, with Vincent Price, he was such an actor and a ham. He just played it up, and the public just loved it. They couldn't get enough of Vincent Price. And as a little kid, at that time, I knew the name Edgar Allan Poe, and from watching these horror films, I thought, gee, Poe must have been some strange dude, writing these scary stories. But it wasn't until the mid-1970s that I became reacquainted with Poe. And that happened, at that time, I was a photographer for this trade newspaper. And I had this assignment to photograph the salesman of the year who lived right across the street from the Poe grave. So I went to his place of business and took his picture, and he said, Jeff, listen, I need your help, and I'll pay you to do this. He said, I'm a volunteer at the Westminster Church, and the mayor is coming down for a tour, and I need someone to take photographs. So I thought, sure, taking photographs of the mayor in a church, why not? But when he took me into the catacombs of Westminster Church, oh, that was it. I just fell in love with the place, and I took pictures of the mayor, and I started out as a tour guide, as a volunteer in the Westminster Church.
Oh, okay.
Unfortunately, the church closed in 1977. There was no congregation, and it closed its doors. And along came the University of Maryland School of Law. They took control of the site. They spent several $1 million in renovating the site, adding electricity and lights, and they turned it into a public meeting hall. And they have weddings, receptions, bar mitzvahs, business functions, and I continued as a tour guide up until right now. I've been a tour guide there since 1976. So I guess you could say I know where the bodies are buried.
Right. Yeah, that's one of the things that I so far have regretted missing. I've been to Westminster many times, but I've never taken the tour through the catacombs. I guess I've just never been there while it was open to do that, but I do hope to do that soon.
Yeah, but I tell you what, the highlight of my career at the Poe House and the Poe grave was meeting Price, my idol.
Oh, wow.
This was in 1977. He was in town performing at the Morris Mechanic Theater doing a play on Oscar Wilde. So I got up enough nerve to speak to the hall manager or the theater manager, explained who I was, and I thought, can I meet Mr. Price? And I expected to hear something like, well, no, who are you? Get away. Everybody wants to meet Mr. Price.
Right.
And he said, sure, come with me.
Wow.
And I thought, what? So he took me to the dressing room, opened the door, and there was Vincent Price taking off makeup. And he says, hello, sit down. And he said, what can I do for you? And I'm sitting there with my mouth open. Right. And he sensed that I froze. And he said, and I didn't know until years later that he used this line for everyone that he met that seemed to be frozen. He said, do you like bread? I went, sure. He says, do you make bread? I said, sometimes. Then we started talking about making bread. And after 5 minutes, it was like we were old buddies. And he used that question on many, many other people. And I was in awe. So I gave him a tour of the Poe House. I gave him a tour of the Westminster Graveyard and Catacombs. And it's like when I shook his hand and he left, I felt like, okay, that's it. I have nothing to live for. I met Vincent Price. He held my arm so he wouldn't fall. And we were like two buddies. And it was just so nice meeting him. He was so gracious. And he was telling me about some of these castles he visited in Scotland, Ireland, and England. And it was great. It was just unbelievable.
Yeah, that's actually one of my regrets is that he had died before I was old enough to be as huge of a fan of his as I am now. I mean, I was around for quite a while he was alive, but I guess my big fandom toward him came afterwards. So that's unfortunately one thing I'll never get to do is meet him and talk about bread.
Yes, I tell you. And, it was because of Vincent Price that I became the curator of the Poe House, because if it wasn't for me, this little kid looking up at the big screen and seeing Vincent Price, hamming it up, I never would have, that seed wouldn't have been planted in my brain about Edgar Allan Poe.
That's incredible to hear that it was basically because of Vincent Price that you landed where you are with the Poe House. That's and cool.
I told him that. I told him that, and he laughed, and he almost did his famous, that I can't imitate it, but that he almost did that, and he said, Jeff, that's the nicest thing anyone has ever said to me.
Wow.
And so when he left in 1978, the Poe House closed. It was managed by a private foundation. The city of Baltimore took it over in 1979 and spent almost $100,000 renovating the site. And I was the first curator. And
Wow.
I was hired in 1979, and the city showed me the back door in 2013.
Why did they do that?
Well, they wanted to move in a different direction.
I see.
It's so classic. It was one of these classic lines like, Jeff, you're fantastic. You're unbelievable. Wow, you're just so great. But don't let the door hit you on the way out. And I at that time, I knew that these things happen. It wasn't like I started crying and what am I going to do? Because in the years of working for the city, I saw it happen many, many times. And I knew eventually it would probably happen to me. And it did. But it was like I had a good run. I had so many adventures. I met so many nice people at the Poe House. So I can't complain.
I didn't know you were the first one there as well. Did they hire another one after you or what?
No, they hired a director. I was the first and only curator. That's not to say sometime in the future there might be a curator, but I'm proud of that distinction. Yeah. And let me tell you real quick, when the first day that I was officially hired by the city, I got this phone call from the mayor's office. And I worked for the mayor, as did all city employees.
Right.
And his secretary said, Jeff, get over here right now. The mayor wants to talk to you. And my first thought was, I haven't had time to do anything wrong. What did I do? The first day on the job. So, and I knew the mayor, he was very outspoken and spoke his mind. So I'm sitting in this big conference room, sweating. So the mayor walks in at the opposite end, walks up to me and he says, Jerome, I've got 3 words for you. Promote, promote, and promote. Now get your ass out of here and promote the Poe House. And he walked out. And I'm sitting there like, what just happened? So that was direct orders from the mayor. And that's what I've been doing ever since, is promoting Edgar Allan Poe. And I'm still doing that now.
I don't know if that's a separate job, but I kind of wanted to ask about that as well. Even though you are the former curator now, you're still doing tours and events there all the time.
Yes. Well, I tell you, when I left the employ of the city, the people that were responsible for wanting to move in a new direction were hoping that I would fade away. But, I have so much fun meeting people. I have all this Poe stuff in my brain. I thought, no, wait a minute. There's no way I'm going to just go away. And I was still doing tours at the graveyard. And I thought, well, I don't care what they think. I'm going to continue promoting Poe in my own way and, let the Poe House do what they want to do. So much to their chagrin, I stayed around, and it gave me some pleasure to know I was irritating them.
Right.
But see, like I said several times, I love meeting people. Yeah. I love talking about Edgar Allan Poe, and I've got all this knowledge about the graveyard, about Poe in my brain, and there's no way I'm going to just fade away.
Did they have anybody else heading up tours or anything after you, or not?
Well, the house was closed for less than a year for renovations.
Okay.
And then they formed this nonprofit group to manage the Poe House. And for me, in the first year or two, it was a little difficult for me to stand back and see them, moving in certain directions.
Right.
But I thought, Jeff, you don't want to be this bitter ex-curator, that stands across the street from the Poe House and stares at it, and I thought, Jeff, life goes on. I had a good run. Yeah. And for a number of years, I had a cordial relationship with the people that managed the house. Right. And, that's life. It goes in cycles. There have been many historic houses and museums that thrive under one person, and then that person retires or dies, and then another group of people move in, and they move in the direction that they want to move into, and that's the cycle of life.
Right.
Life goes on. Poe will be here long after I'm dead, long after they leave the Poe house, and so I'm happy.
What that kind of reminds me of is I could compare it to, say, a band. A band could think they're better than one member of their band. Like, say the band thinks they're better than the singer. They kick him out of the band. Next thing you know, the band is nowhere, but the singer is moving forward still. So you're kind of the front man of that, so to speak.
How many times have we seen that? I mean, that's a good analogy. How many bands have gotten too big for themselves, and they get rid of the singer, and they fade into oblivion, and the singer goes on to fame and fortune.
Right.
But no, that's exactly the situation. And sometimes it works, and sometimes it doesn't. But the important thing is the house is still open. Right.
I was going to say, I think I might have, the one time I went to the house while I was in town, it was closed. The steps weren't even there. Like, it was closed for renovations, I think. So I was going to ask what the dates were that it was closed, if you know.
It closed in 2013, and the city did not make any announcements because they knew if they said the Poe house is closing, there would be a hue and cry from people saying you can't close the house. Right. And after it closed, there was a hue and cry, but it was too late. And cities are noted for doing that. They're not stupid. If they think, well, let's close this museum, but if we give people notice that we're closing it, there's going to be newspaper articles, people yelling and screaming, and we're going to look bad. So we'll close it without notice. And that way people won't know for a couple days. And that's exactly what happened. Yeah.
Right. I can't remember when it was, which trip it was where I did drive by the house, but obviously it must have been during that 2013 period, since the stairs weren't even there. It was just a note on the door, closed for renovations. So,
well, actually, someone ripped off the steps because they weren't attached, and somebody, I guess for a souvenir, took the steps.
Wow.
I thought it was hilarious. And you needed a step ladder to get into the Poe house. I mean, one day they were gone.
Yeah.
And the people in the neighborhood, I asked around, and they said, "Oh, we don't know nothing." I'm going, okay, silly me asking for witnesses,
Yeah, they don't want to get stitches being snitches.
Right. So, but yeah, that was, that must have been the time you came through.
Yeah, that is kind of funny. I mean, I wonder what whoever took it, I wonder what they did with it. Like, put it on their own house or put it inside of their house. Like, what are you going to do with that?
They needed at least a pickup truck, and you needed 2 people to take it. Yeah. And I just thought my first thought was, where are the steps? And then I started laughing, going, somebody came here with a pickup truck, more than one person, picked up the steps, put it in the bed of the truck, and took off. And nobody said nothing.
Yeah.
It was hilarious.
Right. What makes me wonder about that is I wonder if there were people witnessing it happen. And how it went down, because that time when I was there, when the steps were already gone, I just got out of my car to walk up to look and read the note that was on the door. And I don't know, whoever lives in the little, whatever they are, townhouses or whatever, to the left of it, a bunch of people were just kind of standing out on their porches, like looking at me like they're waiting for me to do something wrong. So I was like, no, I better get out of here. I don't know what's going on. So yeah.
They're nice people that live there, but no, they see nothing, they know nothing, they say nothing, and they live a lot longer.
Right. That's a good formula to stay alive.
Yeah.
Anything else we should touch on with your background before we move on to Poe?
My background includes many things.
Yeah.
I first started working when I was 14 years old, and I worked in this department store in Baltimore. And every old city had its famous department stores. In Baltimore, it was Hutzler's and Hochul Cohn's. Well, I worked in Hochul Cohn's, and it was there that I learned, it was drilled into every person that worked there, that the customer is always right. That's where I learned communication skills with talking to people, greeting people. And that stayed with me my entire life. But I also, at various points, was into photography. I was a computer programmer. I was a editor, writer, and photographer for this food newspaper, trade newspaper.
Okay.
And all these jobs that I've had over the years contributed to my skills at the Poe House. It's like
Right.
everything came together. So it wasn't like I graduated from college and with a degree in museumology,
Right.
and I said, okay, here I am. I had the skills necessary to run that house, to manage the house, and to promote the house.
That kind of reminds me of, I don't know if you're familiar with the cartoonist Scott Adams. He's behind the Dilbert cartoon.
Okay, right.
Yeah, whenever he talks about jobs and what he's done throughout his life, he basically, I think he has a book called something like How to Fail at Everything and Still Succeed. But his thing is with employment, he says it's a lot of the time it's better to develop a bunch of different skills that you're pretty good at rather than just one skill that you're excellent at. And he uses himself as an example, saying that he's kind of an average or less than average cartoonist. He's not that great at it. He's kind of average at public speaking, not that great at it, but he lists like 5 or 6 different things that he did for jobs during his life that all kind of came together to put him where he is now.
Yes. I sometimes have to laugh. Over the years, I've met, a number of people that took courses in college, historic preservation, and there's just no market for it. And I see them struggling. And it seems like once you get your foot in the door, you keep that job forever. And the historic preservation, that's a very small field. And even with museums, they have museum studies and similar type programs. The job market is very tight. And when you come out and you have a degree in museum studies, that's all you got,
Right.
So I was very fortunate because I had people skills and I had skills that I was able to incorporate in managing and running the Poe House. So I was lucky.
Right. I can't imagine a degree strictly in museum studies would teach you how to communicate and learn about people.
They don't.
So that's definitely important.
Yes.
All right. Now, the main reason we're here tonight that everyone's probably waiting for is to talk about the death of Edgar Allan Poe. He died on October 7th, 1849. The problem is nobody really knows what happened to him. And that is one of the main reasons I brought Jeff on today. It's because he can tell us at least what we do know as facts and maybe get us to kind of think about what we do know and kind of wonder about what may have happened. So, Jeff, do you want to give us kind of a rundown of what happened with Poe?
Okay. Being the curator so many years, I've heard all kinds of stories, all kinds of theories, and people saying he died from this and he died from that. And currently there are 22 different theories surrounding Poe's death. And it seems like every year there's a new one coming out, just as stupid, just as silly as the previous one.
Yeah.
Now let's backtrack a little bit before we actually get to Poe's death. Poe was living in New York at the time, and he traveled to Richmond, Virginia, to raise money for a newspaper. So he went from New York to Baltimore to Richmond, Virginia. While he was in Richmond, Virginia, he did raise money, and he became reacquainted with a childhood sweetheart, and they became engaged again. While he was in Richmond, he met old friends. He lectured on The Raven, and it was in Richmond where he gave his last reading of The Raven.
Oh.
And this one woman who was in the house, and it opened, the back of it opened to the James River, and there was a full moon. And as he was closing with The Raven, the last lines, she said, a she called it a falling star, but it was a meteor came over his head in the sky.
Wow.
And she said she felt this overwhelming sense of sadness. And
I can imagine.
Was that an omen? I don't know.
Right.
But apparently Poe was ill when he was in Richmond.
Oh.
And his fiancée, Elmira Royster Shelton, was so concerned that when he was leaving the next day, she tried to stop him, but he already boarded the boat.
Oh.
And he complained of having a fever. So, number one, he left Richmond to return to New York, and he was sick. What he was sick from, we don't know. He had a fever.
Yeah.
Now, I've heard people say, I just heard it today, they say, we don't know why Poe came to Baltimore. It's a mystery. No, it's not a mystery. He took the boat from Richmond to Baltimore, was supposed to catch the train in Baltimore to go to Philadelphia, where he had an appointment, and from Philadelphia to New York. So there's no mystery why he came to Baltimore. He was catching the train.
Okay.
Well, this is where the mystery begins.
Yeah.
He disappears for several days. Now, if nothing had happened to Poe and he continued to Philadelphia and New York, nobody would bat an eye that he was missing for several days, because it's not like anyone was looking for him.
Right.
And whenever he visited a city, if he had time, he would try to make business contacts, maybe look up old friends. So that's possible what he was doing.
Right.
However, on October 3rd, this compositor for the Sun papers, Joseph Walker, finds this man outside of a polling place. And he recognizes this man as Edgar Allan Poe. He tries to help him, and apparently Poe told him that he has a friend that lives right in the area. So Joseph Walker sends a note to Dr. Snodgrass saying that there's a gentleman here, rather worse for wear, who says he is acquainted with you. And I can assure you he needs your immediate attention. Please hasten. So Dr. Snodgrass comes to the location. By that time, somebody, maybe Walker, moved Poe inside the voting place, which was a tavern.
Yeah.
So Dr. Snodgrass comes in and he sees Poe slouched on a table, apparently inebriated, wearing someone else's clothing, ripped and soiled, and babbling and not being able to help himself. So
Right.
Dr. Snodgrass sends for Poe's cousin, Nielsen Poe, who also lived in the area. Nielsen Poe comes over with another cousin, Henry Herring, and it was their intent to take him to one of their homes. But after they saw his condition, they realized they can't help him. So they took him to the nearest hospital, which was in the neighborhood right up the street, the Washington Medical Center, where Dr. Moran takes him under his control. So at this point, Poe is delirious. His clothing is all ripped. It's not his own clothing, incoherent, and they find him outside of a polling place.
Yeah.
So Henry Herring leaves, Dr. Snodgrass leaves, and Nielsen Poe tries to take care of Poe, tries to send him linen, clean clothing, and the doctor refused to let Nielsen Poe see him because Poe was being violent, thrashing. But yet during this episode of several days in the hospital, he managed to be lucid a few moments. And when he was, Dr. Moran would say, do you know where you are? What happened to you? Can I get any friends for you? And the minute Dr. Moran said, can I get any friends for you? Poe suddenly burst out, friends? My best friend would be the one to blow out these wretched brains. And then he started babbling again.
Wow.
So Dr. Moran did the best he could. He said at one point he gave Poe beef tea. Now, beef tea to me sounds like maybe broth and tea, but apparently they would mix opium or alcohol in this beef tea mixture, hoping to calm down the person. And maybe it worked, because Dr. Moran said that sometimes he was very quiet, and then he would burst forward, yelling and screaming. And then he would get quiet again. Then he would start talking to people that weren't there. And at one point, he was calling the name Reynolds, and we don't know who that was.
Right.
So one theory is that the doctor, through trying to help Poe, actually caused his death by giving him alcohol and or opium, trying to calm him down. They use that for medicinal reasons. And they also used alcohol. Now get this. This is so crazy. If someone was brought into the hospital who was drunk, I mean, really drunk, they would give that person fresh alcohol, thinking perhaps that maybe it would flush out the bad alcohol. I don't know the logic behind that.
Like running gas through a car.
I don't understand that, but that was an acceptable method of helping people that were brought into the hospital that drank too much.
Weird.
So several days, Poe's going in and out of delirium. And then at 5:00 in the morning, October 7th, he says, "Lord, help my poor soul," and he dies.
Yeah.
So this is where, the mystery deepens, because there was no death certificate. And if there was, it disappeared, because in 1852, I believe, the Washington Medical College closed abruptly, and all the records that were there were burned or thrown away. They left in such a hurry. They left corpses, medical instruments all over the place. So if there was a death certificate, it has long disappeared. Now, even if there was a death certificate, the doctors would, if they didn't know what the person died from, they would make something up, like brain fever, congestion of the brain. Oh, I hope I never catch that.
Right.
Because no doctor in his right mind would put the cause of death as unknown, because that would be a reflection on his talents.
Right.
So they would make something up.
Yeah.
So he was buried in his grandfather's plot in Westminster Graveyard, and thus becomes, the legend of Poe. So what happened to Edgar Allan Poe? Well, the number one theory, now, before I tell you what I think it was, all of the theories have holes in them. Some have holes as big as a Mack truck, and some, like I said before, are just plain stupid. Now, I call this the number one theory, but there are people that say, oh, no, that couldn't have happened. I believe that Poe's a victim of cooping. That's cooping, cooping. And it was election time in Baltimore. And it was a very popular practice, not only in Baltimore, but any city where there was an election. If you were running for office and you were dishonest, now imagine that, a dishonest politician. Thank goodness we don't have that today. But
thank God we cured that.
I know, exactly. So if you're running for office and dishonest, you would hire the police or thugs, and you would kidnap people and coop them up in the basement of a building. Now, Fells Point, which still exists today, was the center of town in Baltimore. That was a horrible area. That's where all the sailors came to get drunk. The soldiers came. Everyone's looking for prostitutes, people being robbed. And here comes Poe getting off the boat with a white suit, carrying a cane and a valise. Talk about an easy mark.
Right.
So if they cooped Poe, well, wait a minute, I'm getting ahead of myself now. So I believe Poe was cooped, and they would keep you cooped up in the basement of a building and use you as a repeat voter.
Right.
Now, you usually didn't want to go along with this.
Yeah.
So they would placate you by giving you alcohol, opium, or they would mix the opium with the alcohol just to keep you quiet. And they would herd everybody up in a wagon and start going around to the different polling places. Now, in order for this to work, the election judges had to be in on it. But you had to insulate the judges for this to work. You couldn't have them being accused of anything. So it was very simple. You would take them to the first polling place and they would vote. And by the time they came to the next polling place, they were changed men. All the clothing was changed. Maybe if they had a mustache, they would shave it off, or a beard, they would cut it off. And that way, the election judge could look at these men and say, they can vote, knowing full well that they've probably already been voted a half a dozen or a dozen times. And by the time they made the circuit and they got back to the coop, it would start all over again. Now, I know it sounds awful, doesn't it? But once you were in such a condition that you couldn't put an X, or you collapsed, or you started fighting, they would kick you out on the street.
Right.
They found Poe, about 20 feet from a polling place.
Yeah.
Wearing someone else's clothing, ripped, soiled, and incoherent. That's what I think happened to Poe.
Right.
But that theory has a few holes in it, but not as big as some of the other theories.
Well, before we move on to the other theories, I was just going to say, and
sure.
I'm sure we already know the answer to this, but at that time, 1849, with having the election judges complicit in this, did people even have to use a name to vote, or was it just, blind voting? We count the number of X's.
Even if there were voting laws, nobody followed them.
Right.
And the thing of it is, they would only coop people that didn't live in the area for obvious reasons.
Yeah.
They would go for the sailors, the soldiers, people passing through like Poe.
Yeah.
And because you don't want to be recognized. It's like, hey, Joe, what did you knock me over the head for?
Yeah.
So I'm sure there was some kind of registration, but my goodness, nobody cared. They were more concerned with getting the most votes for their candidate. If it meant bribing someone, getting someone drunk, cooping a person, that's what they did. And this cooping happened in all the major cities, not just in Baltimore. And some people didn't make it through the voting process.
I did look into it once, as much as you can, but there doesn't seem to be a lot online about an 1849 special election in Baltimore. I, at one time, was hoping to, during one of my Baltimore trips, to get over to the Baltimore Hall of Records and see if they have newspapers from those dates, so I could see the names of the people involved with the elections and see if there was any Reynolds involved. But one thing I did find online, I don't remember where, but apparently there was a judge named Reynolds, but I don't know if they ever looked into that at all.
Well, that's interesting you bring that up, because many years ago, Poe scholars did do research, and they did find out that, like you said, they also found that there was a judge, Reynolds, and apparently there was an election judge, Reynolds.
Right.
And there was also the South Sea explorer, Reynolds. I forget his first name, Jeremiah Reynolds, that Poe wrote about. Now, of course, it's romantic to imagine Poe drifting off into the abyss and yelling, Reynolds, Reynolds.
Yeah.
But, we don't know who that was. Again, it's one of these mysteries.
Yeah.
But, it's possible. There is a theory that Poe didn't call the name Reynolds, that he was actually calling for one of his cousins, Henry Herring.
Yeah.
Now, Dr. Moran, the doctor that treated Poe, did the best he could. But in later years, he made a lot of money by lecturing on the death of Edgar Allan Poe.
Right.
A lot of money. And with each retelling, with each lecture that he gave, the facts were changed.
Right.
At one point, he had Poe quoting from the Bible, long verses from the Bible, verses from the Raven. And it was so embarrassing that I think it was the New York Times, a reporter saw one of his talks and said that it was quite interesting that Poe was in his delirium quoting whole verses from the Bible and from the Raven. And we have Dr. Moran to thank for providing us with such explicit details of Poe's death. So it was almost embarrassing. But people were flocking to his lectures, and in his later years, you couldn't believe anything he said about Poe in the hospital. And some scholars believe that Dr. Moran actually made up the name Reynolds.
Yeah.
So we don't know. It's one of many things that we will never able to be sure about.
Right.
And you just followed in the footsteps of scholars in past years. You did the same thing they did, looked at old newspapers and records and really found nothing.
They probably didn't have the greatest record keeping back then, but I was trying to think if not necessarily someone directly in the election, but maybe someone who was working for one of them might have been named Reynolds. And maybe if somebody cooped him and they even gave him one of their names, which is not likely, I wouldn't think. That's what I was kind of wondering, if somebody involved with the elections off to the sides may have been named that. But who knows if there are any records even close to that. There probably wouldn't be that far back. I
don't think so. And you make an interesting point. And this is one of the things about cooping we're really not sure about, is when you were cooped, did they say, okay, your name is Smith, Joe Smith. Now go vote Joe Smith, or your name is Reynolds, go vote Reynolds, and that's possible. That could have been it. And Poe in his delirium was yelling what he thought was his name, Reynolds, Reynolds. So, but it's an interesting theory, but who knows? Nobody really knows.
Right.
So one theory is that Poe got drunk and killed himself by drinking.
Yeah.
Well, I don't buy that, because now I'm not saying that I ever experienced in my life drinking too much to the point where I was just sick the next day. Okay. So let's clear that up right now. But from what I understand, that if you drink too much, I mean, a lot, the next day you're sick, you're throwing up maybe, and gradually you get better. But that's not what Poe did. He's, for 2 days, 3 days, he was in and out of delirium. That's not a symptom of alcohol withdrawal.
Right.
But if they were feeding him alcohol or opium, that would explain why he lingered in that condition. They thought they were helping him, and in fact, they may have been causing his death. That would explain these ups and downs. Suddenly he's getting better, then he gets sick, then he gets better, then he gets sick, then he dies.
And I think if it is related to that, you can see today, a lot of the times, if you see, like, say, a rock star dies in a hotel, most of the time it ends up being because they combine alcohol with some other kind of drugs. Like, it's usually pills, but I don't know how they would administer opium back in 1849. So I don't really know how they would do that. But yeah, it's the combination, I think, that makes it take them toward death. Yeah.
That's what I believe happened to Poe. Now, back in, I believe it was late 80s, 85, there was a doctor at the University of Maryland who did a blind study of patient X. Yeah. So what he did was he had a group of medical students, and he gave them this patient X. These are the symptoms, and he died. And they told them, find the cause of death. That patient X was Edgar Allan Poe.
Okay.
So most of them came up with rabies. So then it hit the headlines. Poe died from rabies. And the doctor was like, no, wait a minute. No. There were like 5 other causes of death. But see, the doctor that did the research only went to one biography. And he picked and chose what he wanted for this report. And unfortunately, he chose one of the worst biographies, that were out there. And it came up as rabies. But even the doctor that did the blind study said, that's not conclusive, but the media ran with it.
Right.
And they said, he refused water. But the Dr. Moran said, yeah, he took water. So it's like, what's going on here? The doctor just got bad information. So people continue with this rabies theory that he had rabies, Nope. And another one was venereal disease. It's like, come on. He committed suicide. Well, if he tried to do that, he I don't know what he tried to commit suicide with. And if he's committing suicide, why is he going to change his clothing? So carbon monoxide poisoning, it's like at first glance, it's like, yeah, maybe. But it's like, well, wait a minute. Where would he get carbon monoxide poisoning walking around the city of Baltimore?
Right. And not only that, why would it take 4 days in a hospital to kill him and cause him to be delirious at the same time?
Yeah. So this is an example of someone's pet theory.
Yeah.
And there's also a possibility that he was beaten and robbed. Now, there used to be a code of ethics among bums. Not anymore, because we have homeless people now.
Yeah.
But back in that day, there was a code of ethics that if you were a bum or a homeless person walking the streets and you came across another homeless person and that person had like better shoes than you had, you would take their shoes, but you didn't leave him without anything. You would leave him your shoes. If you would take his pants, you would take off your pants and leave them so he had something to wear. I mean, talk about good manners, right?
Right.
But that could explain why Poe was wearing mismatched clothing and soiled and ripped. The truth is, we will never know what happened to Poe. And we have many years to look forward to of different theories. And sometimes when people come up with these theories, they're really not thinking. They're not looking at the facts as we know them. Say, for example, I had a theory that Poe died from hangnail. I would find something in Poe's life, maybe something in his stories that involved a toenail.
Yeah.
And I would say, see that? That's proof that Poe died from hangnail because he wrote about it. Or maybe he stubbed his toe when he was drunk or something like that. So the other thing I want to mention before I forget, Poe was not found in the gutter. Right. Oh, boy, do I cringe when I read that. Now, Joseph Walker said nothing like, Dr. Snodgrass, this guy that says he's Poe, I found him in the gutter. He's, throwing up in the gutter. He said nothing. He said that he was at this location. Yeah. Nobody said anything at any time about Poe being in the gutter. But it fits the myth that he ended up in the gutter somehow. Yeah. And it just drives me up the wall when I read that. And reporters are notorious for saying that.
Right.
And they say, well, that's what I read. It's like, do some research. But that requires effort and time,
Well, one thing, I think a lot of the time people, if they go, say, look something up on Google, they'll just pick one article and it could be like the article could be 25 years old and they won't look for anything newer to show anything different. They'll quote something about rabies from 1996 or whenever, and that's where they'll stop.
Yeah. And when I became the curator, I went to the Pratt Library into their newspaper file. And I was looking at newspapers from the 1870s and 1880s about Poe. And I would read one story and something would jump out at me. And I thought, wait a minute, I heard that before. And then I thought of other more recent articles. And I thought, that reporter that did the recent article did the same thing that I'm doing. He went back looking at newspapers and found something in an old article that he thought was neat.
Yeah.
And he incorporated that or changed it around where someone would say something like Poe stumbled in the gutter and then he would say Poe was found in the gutter. And at least they did research, but they would just grab something that they saw and stop right there and run with that particular statement. That's how these stories began.
Another one from a little more recently. Everyone should know that the John Cusack movie is not a documentary. It's fictional. He was not poetically sitting on some park bench while a nice wind blew through his hair, that
Well,
sort of thing.
when I was at the Poe House, when that came out, I had people coming to the Poe House, which was great because they saw the movie and said, let's go see the Poe House. And they would come in all excited. And they would say,
Right.
Mr. Jerome, where's the park? Where's the bench that Poe died on? And I'm going, no. He died in a hospital. But no, it's in the film. He died on a bench. No. And people didn't realize that was fiction.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, yeah, I know it's not true, but where's the park? We want to take a picture of the bench. It's like, no, but
Right.
One thing, I that film was not a biography, and I have to hand it to the producers and the directors. They said from the very beginning, this is not a story of the life of Poe. It's
Right.
fiction, it's adventure, it's a murder mystery. So they said right up front, we're not trying to present this as a biography. And I got to hand it to them. They were upfront about it, but I knew that people would watch that and they would say, died on a park bench, or,
Yeah.
or he had a pet raccoon or whatever. But it did create a lot of interest in Poe, a lot of discussion on the internet, people arguing about Poe. Did he have a black cat or did he have a raccoon? And in my viewpoint, that was good.
Right.
Because people made the effort, like, we got to go see the Poe Museum in Richmond. But they came to Baltimore because that's where the film supposedly was made. So in that respect, it got the interest of many young people that maybe never would have discovered Poe. Just like that little kid watching Vincent Price on the big screen. Maybe there was a little kid watching The Raven, and maybe that inspired him to do great things when, as he grew up. So it was good in that sense.
There's good reason, many reasons why we're talking about Poe 171 years after his death, partially thanks to people making movies and telling stories and that sort of thing to keep it alive. I think that's a testament to him, not just the mystery of his death, that 171 years later, he's so highly regarded and still talked about in such high terms.
Well, his stories are timeless. Now, you have to remember that when Poe was alive, 1830s, 1840s, there were hundreds and hundreds of other writers writing about all kinds of things. And many of these writers were hailed as the new Shakespeare, and they will be remembered forever. And where are they now? Gone.
Right.
And the few that we remember only because Poe reviewed one of their books and trashed it.
Yeah.
And when I think of that time period, I think of maybe Hawthorne, Longfellow, Dickens, and maybe one other. But what happened to all these hundreds of other writers that were called brilliant and geniuses? They're
Right.
gone. Here, as you so aptly noted, Poe is still hot. And he is still read. People still love him. People do not get tired of his stories. They can't get enough of Poe. And I think that's great. I think that is so fantastic. And that's one reason why when I left the city, I continued to do these Poe birthday celebrations and the Poe Is Dead event in October, because people love these things. They like to go to masked balls with a Poe theme. They like to take tours through the graveyard in which he's buried. And this time of the year, everyone is doing something about Poe. Everyone is having plays, libraries are having Poe exhibits. And I think Poe would be overwhelmed if he knew what was going on in honor of him. I don't think he could handle it. And and every year he gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and such a testament to his genius and to him and to Poe himself.
One thing I often wonder, people tend to say, and I don't know how much truth there is behind this, that he was basically unknown during his life. Like how well known was he?
Well, that's not a correct statement. When Poe lived in Baltimore in the late 1820s. Then he went to West Point, came back to Baltimore, early 1830s. He wrote some poetry, but really wasn't going anywhere with it. So when he was sitting in Baltimore at what we now call the Poe House, he was starving, and he thought perhaps maybe short stories was the way to go.
Yeah.
But he didn't know what to write about. So he did what a lot of writers did and still do to this day. They read the newspaper looking for something that might catch their eye. And that's what Poe did. And something caught his eye. Premature burial, being buried alive. He read stories about this, about people that were accidentally buried alive by doctors and family members who couldn't tell when the person was dead. So you could almost see the light bulb going off in his brain. So right in Baltimore, he wrote his first true horror story called Berenice. This was or some people pronounce it as Berenice.
Yeah.
This story dealt with premature burial, grave desecration, mutilation, obsession. It was a fun story. Well, when it was published, the public didn't think it was so much fun. It got Poe into a lot of trouble. And they said things like, you can't write about things like this. This is too gruesome. You can't do this. And even Poe said, maybe I went too far. I'm paraphrasing here. Maybe I went too far with this, but I was doing nothing more than giving the public what they wanted. And that is the sensational, the bizarre, the horrific. And Poe promised never to do it again. And he actually censored his own story. He took out 3 offending paragraphs that the public said, no, you can't write this. You can't do this. But did Poe keep his promise? Of course not. When you're starving and the public says, give us blood, give us murder, give us black cats, are you going to say, no, I'll starve before I write about that? He wrote about it. He wrote about these things, and many people don't realize this, but Poe did not write about vampires. He didn't write about werewolves or Frankenstein monsters. He wrote about things that could happen to you.
Yeah.
They had horrific murders in that time period. People were murdered. So he wrote about superstition. He wrote about obsession, because these are things that people could relate to. And many of his stories are based on actual occurrences. He wanted his stories to sound as if they were happening right at that moment. And with premature burial, it was like, oh yeah, that happened to, what's his name down the street? Buried alive. Everybody had a story to tell about someone that was related to someone that lived next door to someone that worked for someone that knew someone that was buried alive. Everybody had a story to tell. Yeah. So he incorporated that theme in many of his stories, not because he was obsessed with it, but we were. Poe tried writing comedies. He tried science fiction. He tried love poetry, adventure stories, detective stories, but we kept pulling him back into the horrific, and he socked it to us. He gave us what we wanted.
Just out of curiosity, you said when he removed some paragraphs, are those available today, or did they disappear when he removed them?
That is an excellent question, and I do apologize for not following up on that. When you buy the collected works of Poe, and you go to Berenice, 9 times out of 10, you are reading the censored version. Oh. Now, the uncensored version. Now, how can I talk about this without spoiling it for people? Okay, towards the end of the story, this man was in love with this woman, and she died tragically. So they had her body laid out in the family library. And the narrator goes to visit her corpse. Now, I will stop here. As much as I want to tell you that story, because I love it, I'm going to stop there. So when you read that story, Berenice, and towards the end, if there is no library scene, you're being shortchanged. Okay. That's the censored version.
All right.
Now, when I first read that story, something didn't make sense. Towards the end, I thought something is missing, and it wasn't until years later that someone said, well, hey, Jeff, you dummy, you read the censored version. I'm going, what? And then when I found the paragraphs that were censored, I'm going, now the ending makes sense. But it's the library scene. And what people can do, what your listeners can do, is the next time they're on the internet, go to the Poe Society website, eapoe.org. And they have all of his stories, all of his poems, and all the different versions. They have the uncensored version. And remember, it's the library scene. The people were upset with that. And I thought the ending was more horrific. And I'm not spoiling it for anyone, so don't ask me what happened at the end. But the ending, I thought, was far bloodier, far more gruesome than the library scene. So maybe people in that time period were affected by different things. Maybe the end wasn't that gruesome to them. But Poe wrote that while he was starving. A masterpiece. I have to warn people, it starts off a little slow, but you have to keep with it. And the ending will knock your teeth out, so to speak.
I hope that wasn't accidentally a spoiler right there.
No.
Oh, good.
All right. Let me explain it this way. This story has a real bite to it.
Ooh.
I won't say any more. I'm sorry. That's it.
That's quite all right. You're talking about all these different writers that were around when Poe was around who we don't even remember now. Would you happen to know, were there other people who were writers alive at that time who were really famous, who just totally overshadowed Poe? I guess this question wouldn't make that much sense, because I was going to say who were really extremely famous at the time, but now virtually unknown in Poe's shadow. Because if we don't know them, then we wouldn't know that. So
yeah, well, you would know that by reading some of the biographies. Some of the biographies of Poe, some of them concentrate more on his criticisms than other people do. And Poe's criticisms are available. And when he reviewed a book or a story and it was awful, he would savage the person who wrote it, the story itself. And his nickname was the Tomahawk Man because of his brutal, slashing reviews. He had no patience for writers that puffed themselves up. But if he reviewed a story that maybe wasn't that great, but if Poe saw talent in that person, he would say something like, well, perhaps this story isn't the best that this particular writer can do, but I predict that if he continues to write, that he could be a writer of some note in the future. So he would offer encouragement, but no mercy for the people that puff themselves.
Yeah.
And I wish I could give you some examples, but there were writers that were hailed as geniuses in Poe's time period. Poe made short work of them. So people looked down on Poe. Other writers ridiculed him because he was from the South. And what do people in the South know about writing? I mean, let's be real here, And his parents were in the acting profession. And that was the acting profession was the same as being a prostitute. And so his parents were dead and he was never legally adopted. And here he goes to New England, starting to tell these rich New England writers that what they're doing is hogwash. He was looked down upon, spit upon, made fun of. And I guess in the end, he got the last laugh. But even Hawthorne, well, I mean, he's famous, but if you go to a high school and you say, raise your hands, how many of you heard of Edgar Allan Poe? Everyone would raise their hand. And if you say, what about Henry Wadsworth Longfellow? Who?
Yeah.
Only the teachers would raise their hands.
Right.
And you don't have Wadsworth movies. You don't have biographies of Wadsworth being published all the time. They don't teach about Henry in middle school and high school and in colleges. So in a way, Wadsworth, he is famous, but look at Poe. I mean, there's no comparison. And despite a lifetime of poverty, of illness, being spit upon by your peers, I don't know if I had to go through what Poe went through. I think I would have given up. But Poe didn't cry about it. He didn't say, "Woe is me. What am I going to do? I don't know." He persevered. And despite all of this abuse that he received, he persevered and said, "I want to be the best I can be. I'm a writer. I'm a poet. And this is what I'm going to do." He did it. And I guess you could say he paid the price for it.
I was going to bring up one of those people that we were talking about him criticizing. Did he not criticize someone by the name of Griswold?
Oh my. Old Rufus Griswold, the Reverend Rufus Griswold.
Oh, yes.
This guy was a real piece of work. He made his fame and fortune by publishing other writers' stories, right, anthologies. And that's what he was famous for. And he approached Poe and said, "Hey, listen, Edgar, wink, wink. If you give my new book a great review, wink, wink, I'll do the same for you." Poe hated that. He despised that.
Yeah.
And Poe said something like, "Sure, Rufus, no problem." Okay. So Poe reviews the book and gives it a mediocre review. He criticized Griswold for including poets that really had no talent, but he did offer some praise, saying that overall, we have to pay tribute to Griswold because he did the book. He actually went and found these people, even though some of them aren't worth the paper they're printed on. But, we must admire Rufus for doing this. Well, Griswold read that. You could almost see him getting the book going, "Oh, this is going to be great. Oh, man, right, this book is going to be sold." And he's reading this, and suddenly that smile goes to a frown, and he was furious. He was angry. And that's what started off their relationship. Now, it's long and involved, but suffice to say that there was professional jealousy between the two. Griswold knew that Poe was a genius, but Griswold, behind Poe's back, would spread gossip, would spread rumors about Poe. And when someone would say, "Edgar, do you know Rufus? He's supposed to be your friend. Do you know what he's saying about you?" Poe would say something like, "Oh, come on. No, he's joking. He's not serious. We're buddies, we're tight." And Poe was a very poor judge of character.
Yeah.
So, and there were friends of Poe that knew what Griswold was doing, and they would confront him. But poor Poe just, I guess, laughed it off or didn't believe it. So when Poe died unexpectedly, this rascal Griswold wrote his obituary under a fake name.
Yeah.
In this obituary, he said it started off that, Edgar Allan Poe is dead. Few will be grieved. And, America's lost one of its most brilliant but erratic stars. And then he lays into Poe. He makes things up. He actually included 4 paragraphs, long paragraphs from this book called The Caxtons, about a family. In that book, the author writes about this guy who was insane, how he would walk in the streets at night in the rain, cursing the skies. And he was a bitter person, envious. And whenever he would see someone with money, he would turn green with envy, and he would beat his chest and scream at the thunder. He said Poe was like that guy. And in a later edition, he removed the quotation marks.
Oh.
And how people read. Even today, people don't read. They skim over the article. So people read that obituary and thought, "Oh my God, this guy Poe was crazy." And it backfired because people became interested in Poe. So then Griswold wrote the first Poe biography, where he forged letters in Poe's handwriting and just made up stuff about Poe. And it was a very popular biography, and people read it today and they go, "This is great." And the guy was a reverend, so it must be true. So
right.
Now, this brings up a point. I sort of didn't answer one of your earlier questions about, was Poe famous in his lifetime? Yes, he was. I got sidetracked. Whenever I get so excited talking about Poe, I'll start in one direction and branch off into a different direction and forget about the original question. So I just forgive me. But
I do it all the time.
Was Poe famous? Yes, he was. In the 1830s, he was well known, but it really wasn't until The Raven, when that was published in 1845, that his fame exploded. He became the rock star of the 1840s. His nickname became the Raven. And he was so famous that children would see him walking down the street, recognize him, and they would grab sticks and run after him and hit his heels with the sticks. And he would turn around and raise his hands and yell, "Nevermore!" And the kids would be screaming, running down the streets. And I was probably laughing at this. So he was famous, more so in the 1840s, but the 1830s, people knew who he was. And they knew about his stories. So to suggest that he was unknown, 1820s, 1830s, he was known. 1840s, he was well known. So when he died unexpectedly, it made the headlines.
Right.
But that guy, Rufus Griswold, what a jerk. And I guess there is some justice because he died in 1857, I believe, of tuberculosis.
Oh.
He had a long, lingering, painful death. Good for him.
As I've heard people say many times, the other backfire on Griswold is that the only reason anybody remembers him today is because he made such a fool of himself with that biography of Poe after his death and after everybody found out what a lie it was.
How sad is that? And when Griswold died, he left $2,000 towards the construction of a suitable monument on his grave. Yeah. And his attorney was in charge of that. And the money disappeared, as did the attorney.
Ouch. So
Griswold lies in a unmarked grave, would have been forgotten. Now, when Griswold died, here's the sad thing. He had one of the largest personal libraries in the country. He had a portrait of Poe hanging over the fireplace. And if he hadn't done that to Poe, perhaps we would be talking about Rufus Griswold, who contributed so much to American literature, that had the largest collection and this and that and the other. But no, we look at Griswold now and we say his name, spit on the ground, and say, what a cur, what an absolute ass, stabbing Poe in the back. Judas Griswold, that's what he was. And that is a poor legacy for anyone. Can you sense that excitement when I talk about Griswold and the anger and the frustration in that guy?
Absolutely.
It's like if I could see him, I would just punch him, right in the nose, Right. And he deserved everything he got in his later years. Okay, I'm through with Griswold. Let's move on.
Hey, maybe that can be the next Poe event. We can actually dig up Griswold and let people line up and punch him in his own casket.
Now, don't start giving me ideas now, okay? I might run with it.
The last thing I wanted to bring up is that it looks like you have a Poe Is Dead event coming up.
Oh, yes. This Saturday, October 10th, we have our annual Poe Is Dead event. And this is not a big event. We have the Poe birthday celebration in January, which is the big event. Yeah. But what we do for this event is we have an actor who does theatrical presentations of, like, The Telltale Heart, sometimes The Black Cat. He reads his poetry. We read tributes to Poe, and we do it at his gravesite. We are the only city in which Poe lived that has his body, fortunately. Right. So other Poe cities can have their celebrations, but we are the only one that celebrate Poe at his gravesite. And normally it's a public event, but because of COVID, it's live on Facebook. So if people want to watch this live, you don't have to buy anything or make donations. It's free. They should go to our Facebook page, which is Edgar Allan Poe Evermore. That's Edgar Allan Poe Evermore. 4:00 this Saturday. That's 4 p.m. in the afternoon. And it will run for about half an hour. And this is a shorter version than we normally do because of the COVID restrictions in the cemetery. It's a big touristy area. So it's free. No donations are requested. You don't have to sign up. You just tune in and help us remember Edgar Allan Poe on remembering his death. So that's October 10th, this Saturday at 4 p.m.
All right. One thing I will say, I have been to one of the birthday celebrations, and they are huge and they are fun. So I definitely recommend that to anybody who can be around Baltimore in January. But I have not been to one of the Poe Is Dead events, although it looks like this event, because it's online, this one might even have more people watching it than you normally do.
I know. Exactly. So, and I think that's great. It's always nice to have a crowd to perform for. And I know actors, when they perform to an empty house, it just doesn't work. But when you've got an audience and they're staring at you and they're listening to everything that you say, actors have told me they thrive on that. They even do better. So the actor that we're using, Tony Sandias, is a professional. He can work with an audience or without an audience. And it's going to be awkward in a sense that we've never done a live performance, and we're having problems with the outside noises like buses and sirens because we're right in the middle of Baltimore. So we decided to do this inside the catacombs of the Westminster Hall. Oh, wow. And when we are finished inside, we are going to walk outside to the Poe Monument, where we will put flowers on the Poe grave. So inside for the catacombs among the dead, and outside with the wreath laying among the living.
I definitely plan on tuning into that myself, so I hope everybody else does as well.
And I hope we have no technical difficulties.
Yeah.
So we might have an experiment, but it should be easy enough. Right. Facebook Live, so it should be a lot of fun, and I hope you all do tune in and in your own way join us in remembering the life of Edgar Allan Poe.
Now, aside from Vincent Price, have there been any other well-known people visiting the house?
Oh, let's see. Oh, my goodness. Stephen King. Does his name ring a bell?
I've heard of him.
Who hasn't?
Right.
About 8 years ago, this was during the summer, there was a knock on the door, and I had a tour guide with me. I opened the door, and this man walks in with two young guys and had a cane. And I, told them, welcome to the Poe house. And I told them what to do, watch your step, what to see. And they went into the kitchen, and the tour guide turned to me and said, Jeff, I think that's Stephen King. And I'm going, no. So we're following them on the security cameras. And I'm going, I think that is Stephen King. And this was after, I think, a year after he was hit by that car. Remember, he was jogging and this woman hit him and broke his legs or whatever.
Yeah.
So he came down. I said, hey, you really are Stephen King. And I thought, oh, Jeff, what a stupid thing to say. And he smiled and he said, yeah, I'm Stephen King. I said, well, so pleased to meet you. And we started talking. And I said, Mr. King. And he said, call me Stephen. I thought, oh, okay, Stephen, you can call me Jeff, And I said, do people really think you're nuts? And I thought, oh, Jeff, you just did it again. Asked a stupid question. And he looked at me and he started laughing. He says, you know what, Jeff? I could care less what people think about me as long as they see my movies and buy my books. And it hit me like a sledgehammer. I thought, Poe was the same way. Poe knew that people were gossiping about him.
Yeah.
Poe knew that they were making fun of him. And he heard the gossip about him and his wife, but he would never confirm nor deny these stories because it generated interest in him. And that interest usually was transferred into his articles, into his books. And it increased his fame. And I know some of these stories hurt him, but he recognized the value of publicity, as does or did Stephen King. Now, Stephen King, he's got so much money now and fame, he doesn't have to play up that image of,
Right.
of dark and sinister, but he did in the early days, and he succeeded. And Stephen King was a nice guy.
Yeah.
I just like Poe. You met Poe at his home. He would shake your hand, bring you inside, and he didn't have much, but whatever he had, he would share with you. And
Right.
and when Stephen King left, I thought, wow, I met Stephen King, and he's not strange. He's a nice guy. We also had, what is that actor that, it's a shame that this is what he's noted for. He played in The Swamp Thing with Adrienne Barbeau, that French actor. Tip of my tongue. Well, anyway, people will be saying, yeah, that's so-and-so. Well, he came to the Poe house once, and I gave him a tour of the graveyard and the house. And he gave a nice donation to the house. And I know that there are many of your listeners right now going, yeah, he's, they know who I'm talking about. But he had a long history in movies in the 30s and 40s. But many young people today know him for The Swamp Thing. And he was also a villain in one of the James Bond movies. And if I told you his name, you'd say, oh, yes, of course.
Right.
Famous French actor. Oh, gosh, I gave a tour to, my goodness, this is what happens when you get old. You forget these names. Louis from the Taxi series. Yeah, he was in town making a movie, and they had a reception at Westminster Hall, and he gave him a tour. So we didn't have anyone like Sylvester Stallone. He likes Poe. He did visit the Poe house in Philadelphia. But the fun thing about working at the Poe house is you never know who is going to walk through that door. You just didn't know. But Vincent Price, Stephen King, that's about all I can handle.
Very good. Well, I think we've gone through as much as we possibly can for now. So I'd like to thank you for coming on tonight and enlightening myself as well as whoever's listening. And,
I thank you. It's an honor, and I'm thrilled that you invited me. And I hope I didn't get too excited talking about Poe and started talking too fast. But I would just say this in closing, that I hope your listeners shy away from the myth of Edgar Allan Poe, the dark, sinister, drug addicted, alcoholic madman who lurks in graveyards and, things like that. He was a very dedicated writer, and he knew what he was doing. Every word, every sentence, every paragraph meant something in his stories, and he persevered. Like I said before, and it bears repeating, I don't know if I could have handled what he went through, but despite poverty, hunger, being sick, being abused by his stepfather, and being laughed at by the literary establishment, I don't know if I would have been strong enough to survive that. He did. He persevered, and although he paid the ultimate price, he never wavered. He never wavered from that dream that he had to be the best that he could be. So
Absolutely.
I'll leave you and your listeners with that to think about. And again, thank you for inviting me. I had a lot of fun talking about Poe, and I hope I did enlighten you and your listeners to some of the aspects of Poe and his life.
It was wonderful having you on, and I'm sure we will talk soon. But I just want to say to everybody listening now, thank you for tuning in, and I hope that you hear us again next time. Until then, stay scary.